My computer. Okay, good. I'm starting the recording.
Okay. So, okay, I think it's my, okay, you're starting the recording. Okay, let's see. Everyone, okay, how Asian are the Filipinos? So welcome. I'm Meg Lacy. I'm chair of the Philippine Study Group of Minnesota. We are having this presentation today as a celebration of the Filipino-American History Month. I know everybody has already known what is the Filipino-American History Month, but I'm just going to remind, I'm just gonna say what I have written in here. October is the Filipino-American History Month. In 2009, Congress passed the resolution declaring October as the Filipino-American History Month. Why October? October commemorates the first recorded presence of Filipinos in the continental US, and that was on October 18, 1587, when Filipinos, or so-called Luzones Indios, came ashore from the Spanish galleon and landed what is now Morro Bay, California. PSGM celebrates Filipino-American History Month every year by showing Philippine movies with historical significance. This year, we deviate our celebration to a presentation to one aspect of our history as a people. We are having a presentation on how Asian are the Filipinos. A short exploration into the influence the great Asian civilizations had on Philippine culture using Nick Watkins' 1988 essay, Culture as History, as a springboard for discussion. It is a great pleasure to present Raul Diboki. We truly appreciate his delving into examining the history of Filipino people. Thank you, Raul, for your work in enlightening us and broadening our knowledge on who we are and where we come from. Again, thank you very much for coming. We truly appreciate you. Okay, just for the when we go to the Q&A, you can use the chat to ask your questions, or if you want to ask the question not using the chat, you can just speak up. You can have your video on or not, but if you are speaking, have your video on. Okay, thank you. Again, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, I give now Raul.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Meg.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I just want to say that I don't see the chat screen, so if Paul can moderate, if there's some, something that he sees that I need to address right away, or then he can really interrupt me and say so.
Will do. Yep.
Okay, thanks. So the topic, let me go back to the end of my previous talk, which was about the prehistoric, actually pre-agricultural Stone Age migrations into the Philippines. And the last group of migrants that I talked about had to do with the Austronesian expansion, which is these arrows over here, which showed how the original Austronesians came down from what is here, southern China, into Taiwan and through the Philippines, and then spread throughout the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And at the end of that talk, somebody asked, so are we Asians or Pacific Islanders? Because the Pacific Islanders are all Austronesians. And so that got me into thinking, but then I stopped thinking about it. And then a few, weeks later, I think, or maybe even months, I was going through my books and I came across this book by Nick Joaquin. It's out of print, and he has a set of essays there. And one of his essays sort of kind of addressed that question. How Asian are the Filipinos? At first I said, how Asian are we, but that's not a very exclusive title. So I changed it to how Asian are the Filipinos, which is really what I meant to convey, that this is a discussion where all are welcome. Pardon? Oh, okay. So that's the question. How Asian are the Filipinos? This is not a question of race, because as I've said earlier, race has no biological basis. It's just a social construct that people made up to kind of say, you're not part of us, we're part of you. And usually that means, and we're better than you. Okay. It's not a question of genes either, because your genes do not determine what community you belong to. There are Filipinos who have genes that come from Chinese forebears, from European forebears, and actually, so what set of genes makes you Filipino? There's none. There's no such thing as a set of genes that define your community. So it is a question of culture, or maybe some say it'd be a question of ethno-linguistic group, right? And so that's what we're going to address. What is, you know, how did Filipino culture come about, even though we accept that there is really no homogeneous Filipino culture. There are different cultures in the Philippines. They have some commonalities, but we'll just look at it sort of from a wide point of view and not look at the fine differences. And so this is the essay that I came across by Nick Joaquin, and let me summarize basically what he said. You know, first of all, he defines Asian culture as in terms of the great civilizations of Asia, and he says his first point was that the great civilizations of Asia, roughly speaking, the Confucian, Chinese civilizations, and that includes Japan, Korea, and of course China. And then the South Asian civilizations, which is basically India, and the Islamic civilizations, which is, you know, the Middle East. So he defines Asia as far west as the Middle East. So he said there's not much influence. They weren't interested and didn't have much influence on pre-colonial or pre-Hispanic Philippine societies. His second point was that it was only after Spanish colonization and increased trade arising from it when our Asian neighbors became interested in the Philippines. And from that, there's Asianization. Thus, if you define Asianization as accepting influence from the great ancient Asian civilizations, thus happened concurrently with Westernization to give rise to what we now think of as Philippine culture, this heterogeneous collection of different practices and beliefs that we have from very north to the very south of the country. So I'm going to focus, and he did as well, on there are two aspects of culture that sort of like is a good way to look about cultural influences. First aspect would be belief systems. What is your religion? What's your mythology? And for lack of a better term, for more advanced cultures, what is your basically if you have a developed philosophy about how you view the world. And second aspect would be tools and techniques, or the objects and methods that you have in your culture. And tools and techniques are defined broadly. We're not just talking of hammers and saws and techniques of manufacturers. Tools for communication, tools for education, techniques of learning, techniques aside from actual production techniques. We just define this broadly as the things that cultures do and build and use. So let's start with belief systems. These are one of the things that, I'm going to talk about what Nick Joaquin said, and later we'll react on it. He says, he asserts that the Asian religions didn't really spread that widely in the Philippines. And just take a couple of, a minute to read that. We say we were Christianized or a cultural disaster. This is Nick Joaquin talking, not me or anyone else. Do we ever ask why we were not Buddhicized or Taoicized or Hinducized or Confucianized or Shintoized or Islamized to our cultural salvation? And let me call that out, that's, certainly there has been Islamic influence in the Philippines. And he's quoting, he's basically wondering why did they stop at the Philippine shores? Why did they never ever cross into the Philippines as in a more comprehensive way, in the way that they did, for example, in Indonesia and Malaysia, or what we call now Indonesia and Malaysia, which are our nearest neighbors to the east. So that's what he said, but let's look at the first one. India, or I call the Indic influence, was actually the first great Asian civilization to sort of have some influence on the Philippines. It's not true that there was zero influence at all. For example, let's look at words that were imported from the South Asian languages, especially Sanskrit. There are at least 350 Indic words in Philippine dialects. Okay. We need to be cautious about the presence of these words because, F. Landa Hojano, probably the preeminent anthropologist in the Philippines, he did caution that just because we have borrowed words, that doesn't establish the level of cultural influence. So we have to be careful when we look at these words, but the thing is, words for concepts, including spiritual concepts rather than physical objects or geographical features, may imply a deeper influence. Because, if you just have a word for example, a type of food, like this one in Tagalog, puto, which came from Tamil, right? If it's a name of an object, then you can understand that maybe I would just use that for convenience. But words for conscience, deity, faith, the noble class, the maharlikas, the faith, which is kalma in Kapampangan, and then the Kapampangan also imported dharma, divine law, and it's damla in Kapampangan. So these words, bathala for God, deity, buddhi for conscience, these are spiritual or psychological concepts, but mainly spiritual concepts that you can't just point to something and say, okay, the word for that is, this is what we'll use. There must have been some input and some discussion, some contemplation when these words were incorporated into the language, which means there must have been some interaction that is more than just introduction of an object or a tool or just naming a geographical feature. And look at early Philippine mythology and epic poetry. It said that the common themes, plots, and ideas were borrowed from the great Indian epics, the old Indian epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. In fact, there's a Maranao epic, the Maharadya Lawana, which is basically a local version of the Ramayana. So we cannot deny that there is Indic influence, Indic meaning coming from the Indian subcontinent. And even a more direct, so still in the topic of belief system where religion comes in, you have even one physical evidence, which is the Golden Tara. This is a sort of a Buddhist saint that was discovered in Agusan del Sur. Now the thing about it though is that the hand gestures, are wrong. There are 4 basic hand gestures in Buddhism, and this is sort of like a poorly copied version of misunderstood. So obviously the person who made this statue did not understand, fully understand the Buddhist religion, did not have as much knowledge on it. You know, there are a few other Buddhist statues, but they are considered to be important. This one was made in the Philippines, in Agusan del Sur, which is part of, I'll talk about it later, the Butuan Kingdom, which will loom larger in this discussion. Now, of course, we can't just gloss over Islam, and this is how Nico Kin talks about it. He says, basically saying Islam had a 200-year head start in the Philippines before the coming of the Spanish. The Islam was introduced in 1380, and somehow it did not spread as far and wide as, for example, how Islam spread at the very onset in the Middle East. So I dug up this map from the time of the first 130 years of Islamic expansion. This is the amount of territory that it spread to. Okay, that's just 130 years. In the Philippines, by the 19th century, this is the most useful map I can see. The Islamic areas are these colored areas over here. Blue is the Sulu archipelago, okay, and there might have been some recession since the height of Islam in the Philippines, but basically in 200 years until the coming of the Spanish, Islam was limited to these areas in the archipelago. Now, there was already by the time, I'll talk about that later. So he was saying that, you know, this is Nico Kin. Certainly it seems odd that for 1,000 years and more, our neighborhood was crisscrossed by the roots of militant faiths that somehow never found their way to us at a time when a conversion to them would have ensured us an Asian soul. Okay, so this is his contention. There doesn't seem to be that eagerness to spread the faith in the Philippines. And that's why he said they're not that interested in people who lived in what is now called the Philippines. Okay. Now let's move on to tools and techniques, you know, the objects and methods that we employ in day-to-day life and in the culture. He's saying that there was sparse prehistoric technology transfer, technology writ widely, not just, you know, from Asian civilizations. That is Nico Kin's contention. And he says it much more succinctly here. We did not get the wheel from India, nor the theater from China, nor the plow from Thailand, nor the hospital from Cambodia, nor city culture from Malaya, nor the horse from Japan, nor spice culture from the Indies, nor architecture from Java, nor mathematics and sciences from the Arabs. So that's, you know, like it's like a barren land of you know, in the Philippines at the time when all the surrounding societies were pretty much, you know, very advancing in terms of their tools and techniques, in terms of their technology. And he was quoting, and this again from Nico Kin, mention of us in Chinese annals is so slight and so doubtful that scholars are still debating whether the references were to the Philippines at all. You know, and this is something that cannot be contested, that the mention of the other surrounding societies really are, there was a lot more than mention of the Philippines, although Philippines was mentioned, or not the Philippines, but kingdoms that are basically, that were in the Philippines at the time. And we'll talk about that later. And so let's look at tools and techniques more closely. This is, from things that I found out about, perhaps the most important tool for a culture is writing. And so I looked at Philippine historic scripts, and for sure there was writing in the Philippines. I don't know how widespread exactly, but as early as 900 CE, okay, that's more than 1,000 years ago. If you've heard of the Laguna copper plate inscription, this was very famous, and then the script used here, that means the writing system, is very similar to the Indonesian Kawi script, and the language is basically Old Malay or Malay with some Sanskrit and Old Javanese words thrown in it, and some Old Tagalog honorifics. Honorifics would be like Mr. and Mrs. or whatever, and Raja, Datu, and things like that. And they were deciphered to be an official discharge of debt. It's not literature, it's not poetry, it's not a diary, it's basically a certificate saying so-and-so has paid this debt and he doesn't owe anything to so-and-so as well. That's 900 CE. And then much later with more evolution, I think everyone has heard of Baybayin, which is the old, I'd say Tagalog script, but it's widespread, And some sources I read claim at least 16 different writing systems in the use prior to colonization. Although how different is some would say these are just variations of Baybayin. And Baybayin is descended from Indic scripts, especially Kawi, which is that previous, this one, that's in Kawi script, 900 CE. And this is more recent, a few hundred years later. It was the most widely used Baybayin, encompassing Luzon, Palawan, Mindoro, Pangasinan, Ilocos, and these are all coastal areas where they've been, where the communities or the societies are. The thing is, the Spaniards actually modified Baybayin to accommodate other phonemes, that just means sounds, such as consonant ends, words that end in a consonant. They modified it to say that rather than saying, because they would use the na sound, for example, something ending with n, so they probably would have been originally written as Baybayin na, although the part of na is not pronounced, so they introduced a symbol to say don't pronounce the vowel after that. Then there are still 4 in use to the present day, 2 by the Mangyans, 2 groups of Mangyans, and 2 in Palawan. But so here's an example. It's Tagalog region, the most widespread one. And there are basically 3 vowels. And you see that A and E and O. And that's true for almost all the different regions, just 3 vowels. Okay. Now, the thing about Baybayin, when we grew up, we were taught in the Philippines that the Spaniards eradicated the use of Baybayin. They intentionally burned all the writings that were in Baybayin, and that might not be true because anyway, the early Spanish described that the local inhabitants were fairly literate, and it's not just the noble or priestly classes, unlike, for example, in Egypt or in old Sumerian empire, or in Sumer, where only the priestly classes could write, and it was specialized function. In fact, the first And so they had to use baybayin if they wanted to proselytize. And so the first printed book in the Philippine language is the Doctrina Cristiana en Lengua Española y Tagala. It was published with Tagalog text in both, baybayin and Latin scripts. And here's a page from it. It's published in 1593. 74 pages in Spanish and Tagalog, and you can see the baybayin right there. And then in Tagalog, and then the Spanish. There are also some pages with Tagalog in Latin script. And only one copy exists now, and it's held in the Library of Congress. So if somebody wants to go there and take a look at it. Now, the other thing that Nick Joaquin said was that we always say that we were a seagoing shipbuilding people and we're extensive. If we were really a shipbuilding people and extensive traders, then that vagueness about us becomes incredible, as say, because it's not mentioned in our mythology, and that is the vagueness that he meant. Well, how come our mythology doesn't talk about seagoing and things like that? And it's incredible to not have that. It's like there's no mention of Phoenicians, as if the Greeks never mentioned the Phoenicians. If it's something that's true, it should have had shown through in the Philippine pre-Spanish mythology. And he says there's really none, and you can go into the article itself and see how what the legends that he talks about. But I think there is a shipbuilding and seagoing tradition. Of course, we all know that. We have the Vintas and other vessels made in the Philippines, and just showing a picture here of a reconstruction of a Caracoa. That's a prehistoric Philippine warship. And I'm going to talk about this. This is a series of discoveries, and they're called the Butuan Balangays, that were found in Butuan City in Surigao del Sur. Okay. From 1976 to 2012, 9 vessels were found in Butuan City and carbon dated as early as 320 CE. That's more than 1,500 years ago, and the shipbuilding tradition in the Philippines was already existing. And the latest discovery in 2012 is a mothership that's about 82 feet long. So that's about the size of Caracoa, a war vessel. And most of the other ships were 49 feet long. And just to point out, the caravels that Columbus sailed in were about 75 feet long. So this is from the National Museum of the Philippines. This is just a picture, a diagram of the archaeological dig. It hasn't been fully lifted out of the site, at least the latest that I can find. And this picture is not accurate. It's just some artist trying to get a scale of the mothership and then all the others that were found near it. See, there's one small one here and then above it, and then they discovered later on this mothership. Okay. And that's a picture of the mother Balangay still in situ, still where it is. And just to give you an idea of the various types of vessels that were built by Filipinos, this is from probably a very good source. Someday I hope to be able to read it from Francisco Alcina's Historia de las Islas e Indios de Vizcayas. It is pretty obvious that the Philippines were, or the people who were in the Philippines then were boat builders, because he described how the boats were manufactured, were built, and also gave the terms that were used by the builders for different processes, the different procedures and the parts of the boat. So it's not true that there was no shipbuilding tradition in the Philippines at all, which is to assert would be kind of actually would be puzzling because most of all of the people who came to the Philippines went there by boat. There's no way to walk to the Philippines. You had to be a seagoing people if you were going to migrate to the Philippines. And so these are the Butuan Balangays. And so I want to talk about the kingdom of Butuan, because he was saying that there was very little trade, very little contact between the societies or the different kingdoms in the Philippines and the surrounding, for example, China or India. I think it's true, not with India. The connection through India was indirect. It was through basically what we call now as the Indo-Chinese societies or Southeast Asia. So the kingdom of Butuan, it flourished from the 10th to the 13th century. And it was mentioned in the Song Dynasty annals in China as early as 972. And in fact, there was a more detailed record of emissaries from the kingdom of Butuan trying to negotiate trading links with China. Its sphere of influence, not necessarily, they probably did not have full control, but their sort of, I don't know how you describe it, but their sphere of influence or their cultural influence covered Agusan del Norte, the provinces, Agusan del Norte, Agusan del Sur, and Surigao del Sur. There was an exhibit a few years ago about gold items produced in the Philippines, and Butuan is sort of the main area featured, although there was gold being produced in the Batanes Island and certainly other regions. But Butuan was now known for production of gold items. And in that exhibit by the Asia Society, I said the amount of gold discovered in Butuan far exceeds that found in Sumatra, which is the island where the Srivijaya Empire was based. And so you can't call that a minor kingdom in terms of the trade that they did and the manufacturers that they produced. And just to lifted from that same exhibit, the traders from Butuan did not just trade in gold. They brought in camphor cloves, mother pearl, tortoise shells, and went back with gold and silver and ceremonial flags. Although not the Philippines also had their local sources of gold. The gold wasn't imported. There was also, just as an aside, the Chinese text also mentioned traders coming from Mindoro Island. It was considered to be a different country at that time. So summing up, this is what Nick Hawkins said: the Philippine condition in pre-West Asia can thus be summed up in two words: unknown and unknowing. While the attitude of our neighbors to us can likewise be summed up in two words: ignorant and indifferent. So that's what Nick Hawkins was saying, and that was a controversial assertion, and certainly even at that time, a lot of Filipinos, a lot of people, especially historians and anthropologists and archaeologists, said not so fast, But anyway, we'll follow his narrative. So we're talking about pre-Hispanic Philippines, and now the Spaniards come, and this is what he says. Through the centuries of our supposed contacts with the Chinese, They were already a paper culture. We continued to write on tree bark. The Indons were already a book culture. We continued to write on tree bark. The Arabs were already a print culture. And these are all cultures we were in contact with, and we continued to write on tree bark. And it says, but within 30 years of Legazpi, we took the first step into paper culture, print culture, book culture. These are, again, part of the tools that the society has at its disposal. Culture. Yeah, briefly, real contact started with 1565 when Miguel Lopez de Legazpi arrives from Mexico to establish Spanish control over the Philippines, and he picked Cebu for the first capital of his colony. He transfers the capital to Maynila in 1571 after subduing the local datus and rajas, who are vassals of the Sultanate of Brunei. Two things. It's the Sultanate of Brunei that sort of is the overlord of Maynila at that time, not the Sultanate of Sulu, not the Sultanate of Maguindanao, but Brunei. So the spread of Islam to Manila did not go through the sultanates that were thought of as the Philippines, and the one in Brunei. That doesn't really matter because the Philippines, the political entities we know as Philippines, Brunei, and Indonesia didn't exist back then. But this just shows how interchange between different regions there was wider than just the Philippines. The other thing is, these are the titles that were used, datus and rajas. Raja is borrowed from Indian, of course, but datu is an Austronesian word. Right? So just to show how things have been sort of combined by then, the mix of influences. Sorry. So that's what we said, the Spaniards came, and in their heels right away, as soon as they come, we have a Chinese influence pouring in. So Nikokin says, suddenly we are no longer terra incognita with China, as soon as Spanish come. This land ignored by Asian progress finds its neighbors come crowding with their produce and manufacture for the gallant trade, dealt not only in Chinese sales, but with the entire gamut of Asian commodity. So that's what he's saying. It's when the Spanish came, our neighbors became more interested in the Philippines. So briefly, shortly after, what is the title here? Yeah. So Legazpi establishes capital in Manila, and the Chinese traders, craftsmen, artisans, merchants that are indispensable to an economically thriving colony arrive. And they are required to stay in a segregated section of Manila called the Parian. And by 1586, there were 10,000 Chinese in the Manila Parian, while the Spanish numbered no more than 500. By the end of the 1500s, there are 30,000 Chinese in the Manila Parian. The Manila Parian was not the only Chinese enclave in what is now the Philippines. You have some in Cebu, one in Cebu, which is actually older than Manila's, Iloilo, Vigan, Batangas, Pampanga, all over. And so this is when really the voluminous transfer of Chinese tools and techniques to the Philippines began. And I'm saying tools and techniques. The belief systems, still not so much. In fact, a lot of the Chinese in the Parian converted to Catholicism. Not all, a lot of them. And just an example of how this Asianization came alongside the Hispanization of the Philippines, Chinese cuisine in the Philippines are referred to under Creole names. That Creole means expatriate Spanish. pancit guisado, camarón rebozado, and all these things. So this is really a Chinese dish, but we grew up thinking of it as camarón rebozado, which is breaded shrimp in I forget what type of sauce that is. And so it concludes, two processes were going on simultaneously and side by side, one the process of our Westernization, the other the process of our Asianizing. And it should be and the latter process may have been the more powerful one, since after all, the Asians then flocking to our land, especially the Chinese, greatly outnumbered the Westerners. So this is his view about how the influence of the great Asian civilizations came to the Philippines. You know, if we are as Asian at all as we are, it is thanks to the mediation of the West, which brought us into Asia and vice versa. So there's the picture I thought was very appropriate. You have the Spanish galleon right here and the Chinese junk in Manila Bay, which sort of shows the equal or the influence that was happening, the influences that were pouring in at the same time, as per based on Nikokin's interpretation of history. So thank you very much for listening in. And I welcome your thoughts about
Okay, who's going to ask the first question?
I just want to say that it's an excellent talk. I thank you for summarizing, Raul, and helping us understand the sequence of these events.
mhm.
I have a question now. What I never got the impression of why the Chinese would start moving into the Philippines once the Spanish established themselves. I mean, I know the galleon trade ran out of Manila, but why all of a sudden, if the Spanish are there, the Chinese, from the Fucanese people, mainly, I expect,
Yeah.
started
Yeah.
flocking to the Philippines, if Nick Joaquin is correct.
Well, from what I understand, they were reluctantly invited by the Spaniards, by the Spanish, because their enclave, their colony there could not function without the skills and technology of the Chinese. They were furniture builders, they were ship builders, they were bakers, masons, and all that.
Must be Marco Polo.
Pardon?
I said, must be Marco Polo, and knowing that they were the Western Spanish.
Yeah,
The Chinese knew
Yeah.
about the trades with Europe already.
right.
And
Yeah.
so they said, well, there's the people we can trade with. They're the Spaniards are over there.
Mhm.
So they all came over.
Mhm.
So the Spaniards must have also been exploring around the region and
Oh, yeah.
made contact with the Chinese trading areas that were along the coast, I would expect.
Right. And the crew members and the soldiers a lot of them were native Filipinos. And this is what he meant by the Filipinos. The Asia coming to the Philippines and Filipinos or people who were then living in the Philippines going to Asia. That's what he meant by that. Now,
Raul, can I ask you a question?
Sure,
This really
yeah.
goes back to why you chose Nick Joaquin as your basis for this topic. The
Oh.
topic is how Asian are Filipinos. And I find that he's not a historian,
no,
not an archaeologist,
no,
not an anthropologist, not even a sociologist.
right.
I find his approach pretty shallow, frankly.
Oh, yeah, it is. It is, you know.
And so then there are so many things that you presented that contradicted the things that he was saying.
Yeah.
And I don't even get a concept from this book as to what's Asian to him. You know, what is
Yes.
Asian? I mean, these tools that he's talking about. I mean, they're really just small portions of what
Right.
consists a society's culture, actually.
Mhm.
So was there a reason why you chose this particular book as a basis for presenting this topic?
Yeah, well, it's mainly, you know, it's the one article that I found which kind of addressed the whole, because as I said, what that started it was in the previous talk, somebody asked, well, then are we Asian or are we Pacific Islanders? And then I came across this article, and yes, I admit that it's a point of view. It is not the last word on the topic. And so I thought of it just as a good jumping off point for discussion, for looking into the, you know, that question of how Asian are we? And he defines it in terms of we are Asianization as the influence of the great ancient Asian civilization. So I thought that's a good way to get a handle on the topic without accepting that, oh, he's right, you know, that Nick Joaquin is right. That's really what happened, and certainly a lot of people who are, you know, as you said, historians and anthropologists and archaeologists and specialists objected to what he was saying. But in terms of as an overview, as a way to get a handle on these things, I said, well, it's almost once as good as any. It's just an entry point into the discussion. Yeah.
Raul, I don't understand from his view or your presentation why Islam stopped at Indonesia, where I always heard correctly or incorrectly that Filipino, Malaysian, and Indonesian are related. And
Yeah.
that there's commonality in languages and ethnicity and everything. So
Right.
why does, in his view, why then did Islam stop at Indonesia? Why didn't it not keep going? It does not clear to me.
Yeah, there are two things. First is he said like maybe they weren't as fervent anymore. There's one of the things said about spreading the faith once they got to the outer reaches of Southeast Asia, you know, and then he says there that they also did a lot of leapfrogging in terms of they didn't seem to be interested at all in the Visayas, even though naturally you'd think if you're already in Mindanao, then you'd go to the Visayas before you go to Luzon. And in fact, Islam got to Luzon, to Maynila, and without going through the Visayas. And to be honest, the spread of Islam stopped because of the Spanish conquest. I mean, they expelled, you know, they stopped the Islamization in Manila. When they made it the capital and defeated Ras Sulaiman and Lakandula, and so it did stop because of Spanish arrival. But he was saying it was slow. It had slowed down, and who knows why it was slowed down. One thing I have is that, you know, what I thought of is that the Philippines really isn't as how do you describe it? The Philippines was a mosaic of kingdoms during that time. And in fact, he sent us a map of those kingdoms. And it's just not as, what's the term, cosmopolitan, maybe, as the other Southeast Asian islands like Sumatra or Java or Bali, for example, which is really a Hindu society. So yeah,
But
it's puzzling too.
yeah, but and if you look at Europe, Islam stopped in Spain basically, or they got, I guess, to southern France or whatever. But
Mm. Yeah.
you know, and Islam has still always been connected to Mecca. They were going a
Mhm.
long distance from
Right.
their spiritual homeland.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, Islam was introduced in 1380, and it's actually an Arab missionary or trader named Makdum. So the Islam is spread directly from Arab proselytizers, and unlike, for example, Buddhism in the Philippines came through Southeast Asia, through what is now the Malay and Indonesia. There was no direct contact with India, and it's certainly not through China, because the Indian influence in the Philippines, especially the Buddhist influence that have been found, are not the version of Buddhism that came through China. It's really a more direct, Indian version. It's not syncretized through China, so it's much earlier than the Chinese influences in the Philippines. Now, throughout that whole time, the Chinese were trading with the Philippine kingdoms, but these are kind of like small-time traders. They just sail to the seashore, or sail to the shores and then trade there and then leave, and there was no settlement or anything like that.
Raul,
Yeah.
I guess I just want to say that I know that there are all kinds of things that influence the Philippine culture. And I don't really think that we should just then say, oh, well, it's just woe with us. We did not really get influenced by these big cultures. I think that a lot of cultures are a melange of things. And with us, we are probably, there's not easy to point out dominant influence, but maybe the Spaniards, because they colonized the Philippines for 50 years, well,
300 plus years. Yeah.
350 years. And then the Americans came, and the Japanese came, and all this kind of stuff. But so we're really a mixture of cultures, and I don't really think that we should be sorry about that kind of a thing. I think that we have emerged also as a fairly strong people, and that we really don't have to look at China or India or wherever to define ourselves as who we are. We are located in the Asian continent and in the Asian area, and maybe that's just how we relate to Asia. You can talk to people from the Cambodia or Thailand and so on. They think of them as Thais, not Asians. When they're Thais, they're Burmese. So we are Filipinos, and I think that Asian is just a construct of geography. The map makers did it.
I agree with you completely and totally. And that's one of my comments here, that just because we did not have as much cultural influences from South Asia, from East Asia, from the Middle East, that's not really a loss to us, and that doesn't make us less Asian. We are as Asian as we want to be or need to be when we're talking about things where we have common interests with other Asian nations. Then of course we are Asian. But I agree. That's Asian. It's another social construct, right? And so I wanted to point that out, that who decides who's Asian? I think Asian is where you're located, at the very least, the way they define Asia.
Yeah.
In terms of
You could ask the question, how Asian are the Madagascar? Madagascar. I mean, they speak a Malayo-Polynesian language and were influenced, but they consider themselves African, and that's fair
Mhm.
enough.
Yeah, it's fair enough, you know. I think you can be romantic about it, or you can also be pragmatic. Where do your interests lie? Where do you have commonality of interests? And of course, do what's good for you, you know.
So on that
Um,
note, I sort of talking about the definition of what is Asian, and as you showed, when the influence of the Spanish came, and that's what sort of catalyzed the influence of the Chinese. Is there something to be said about the pre-Western or pre-Chinese Philippine culture being resistant to adopting these external influences, maybe in hopes of preserving either their native or indigenous cultures and beliefs?
Yes, there's something to be said about it. In fact, I'm thinking, you know, who knows? Maybe the some of the local society, local Philippine kingdoms or tribes or what have you, maybe said, no, we're not interested in this religion you're bringing to us. We have our own, and certainly, you know, we have Digna over here who can tell us about groups in the Philippines who said we want to maintain what's ours. You know, and as I said, the Philippines was a mosaic of different kingdoms. There was no overarching administrative or you know overlord who ruled over the islands, and people basically, some are open, some aren't, and there's nothing to say one is better than the other. Societies choose their paths as much as possible, and yeah.
You can look at the Aita people as a prime example of
Mhm.
deciding that they didn't want to interact with the Malay lowlanders.
Right.
They did their thing.
Right, and the mountain the Ifugao and related tribes did the same thing. When see the Philippines went through a wave of migrations, right? The first were those prehistoric Neolithic migrations I talked about, and then after that, you get a hodgepodge of people coming from all over Southeast Asia mainly. And what I think I noticed from not just reading about migrations to the Philippines, but when a migration is seaborne, right? You know, and they land on the seashore, and they come in contact with, maybe there are residents there already. One of two things can happen, or three things. The residents just say, okay, we'll go along with you, or they might fight them off, in which case the would-be migrants would say, oh, it's not worth the trouble, right? And move on, or they try, or the locals might fight them off and get defeated, or the locals say, okay, you have superior war making skills, we'll just move away, you know. And that's usually because you are a seaborne people, then you have an advanced, more advanced seagoing technology. The original inhabitants usually move into the interior and up the mountains. You know, that's true here. I think that's what happened in New Guinea, and pretty much you can say that's probably the pattern all over the globe.
Back to the
Raul, I'd like to thank you for your getting this conversation started. I guess we have a lot to think about in this issue, so I won't be able to stay, but thanks a lot.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for listening in.
back to the question of why the Chinese showed up. I just looked up, Macau was leased by the Ming Dynasty to the Portuguese
Mhm.
1857. So the Chinese government realized that the Western governments are interested and they're coming and they've got a lot of things. And it could well be that they waited for a large interaction until the Spanish got there, figuring that the Spanish would be all set to organize or to centralize all the wealth of a country. And now our traders can go there and they've got other colonizers, if you will, and
Right.
they can all work together to exploit or do trade with this area better than ever.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's I don't think that you can't rule that out, you know. But I think basically the Chinese came to the Philippines because of the economic opportunity, and certainly the relations between the Spanish colonial administration and the Chinese in the Parian was not always smooth. In fact, the Parian was burned down, I think, about 2 or 3 times throughout history. And the Chinese in the Parian also rose up in revolt against very onerous conditions that were being imposed on them by the Spanish administration. And the history of the Parian is not a completely peaceful one, you know. And but every time the Spaniards would expel them, they were actually episodes of expulsion. A few years later, they would ask them back because the Spanish enclave could not function without the skills and the know-how of the Chinese. You know.
For me, one of the reflections that come out of this presentation, How Asian Are We, is the recognition and the awareness that, like, even without the influences, like pre-colonial stage, for me, coming from a tribe, people would have called themselves as they wanted it. Like Igorots, for example, is not the original term for the people. It's like Ibaloy, Ikalahan, or something like that. But because of colonization, we are umbrellaed under a certain term. And even if we want to debate further, like my reflection would be, is Filipino term should be a term for all of us. Because of colonization, it wanted to like make an archipelago into one system, which is not possible. Like for me, up to this day, I go to Philippine different groups and there's a feeling of like there is the nuances of different regions, different islands. And so how Asian are we? How Filipino are we? It's a great topic to continue to reflect on and maybe just a point of conversation. So thank you so much, Raul.
You're welcome, Digna. You know.
I echo Digna's comments, and also I echo Gary King's. I think, Raul, you did a really very good job in putting things together, researching it, and getting all your sources together, and presenting it to us for us not doing all the work. So thank you very much, Raul.
Yeah, I just have a couple of things to say. First of all, Nick Joaquin's narrative or analysis is now looking back now with a change in outlook of it, which is inevitable. His narrative only really applies to the non-Muslim regions of the Philippines. So it's a little ethnocentric, you know, to say that we're not that Asian. Well, in terms of influence, and he defines Asianness as the influence of the civilizations, which again, I say, well, that's what you define Asianness to be. I don't really define it that way, but it's a good point of conversation to start the conversation, you know. So the Islamic areas of the Philippines did not have sparse influence from at least one Asian civilization, ancient civilization, you know. And yeah, so that's the other comment that I wanted to make sure to bring out there.
Okay, any more comment, one more comment or question? And
Well, maybe I'll ask a question.
Sure.
there,
You talked about the cultural and linguistic, but you had ruled out early on any genetics. And you
Yes.
did not really touch on geography, that you're
Mhm.
in Asia physically because of you're closer to Taiwan.
Right.
But, and I also wanted to mention that the Pacific Islander is only a classification from the US Census. And it's mostly Philippine Americans who are conscious of that distinction. But anyway,
Mhm.
getting back to genetics, in terms of a lot of Filipino Americans here, can you be Filipino based on your cultural and linguistic, or do you have to actually be born there or have a relative born there in the Philippines?
But for me, I don't know other things. I have an expansive view of Filipino-ness. Basically, it's almost like, you want to join us? You're welcome. You know, that is my view. You know, and I don't know how other people think. So Filipino-ness in terms of, you know, my view is expansive and open. You know, I certainly would not say that my children are not Filipino or not Chinese because, you know, because of my wife, just because they weren't born in the Philippines or in China, because they certainly have by hook or by crook have assimilated aspects of the culture that we carry. Yeah, you know, and as terms, so I said, it's not a matter of genes, again, because there's no you know, DNA set that says if you have this DNA profile, then you're from the Philippines. You know, it's culture.
Well, actually, there's been research on 80,000 Filipinos looking at their DNA,
Mhm.
and they actually divide up where the genetic influences were coming from. And
Right.
they were 53% Southeast Asian and Oceania, 36% East Asian, 5% Southern European, and 3% South Asian
Mhm.
in India.
Yeah.
And those correspond roughly with some of the influences you talked about and,
Yes. Yeah.
coming into the country.
Right.
But you also didn't quite talk about the post-Spanish era, but I guess that's because we're most familiar with that.
Yes. Yeah.
But I do want to thank you for giving us that, particularly the early linguistic. I appreciate it.
Right. Thanks.
Thank
And you're very welcome. Yeah. You know, there's, you know, going through this material, there are a lot of things like, oh, it'd be nice to go into some more of the early Sanskrit influences on the languages in the Philippines, because there certainly were a lot. And I hadn't heard of the kingdom of Butuan until I delved into this topic, and there's a lot to be said about that kingdom. In fact, they had emissaries that went and attended the first mass held in the Philippines by Magellan. So you know, there has been a lot of interaction between the term that they use is polities in the Philippines, and yet they maintain their separateness or their separation. They're distinct kingdoms or polities, but there's been interaction between them, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. And you know, the other thing I get the feeling of is piracy was a big industry then among the Filipinos. And if you look at the, you know, the warship the Caracoa, and you read about the Dutch and English and Spanish ships that had to fight off pirates in this part of the world in Southeast Asia. And they say, maybe that's why, just connect these things. So these are things that you come across that are surprising and interesting.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, guys, for coming, everyone. And Raul, thank you so much. And we need more. We need more conversation with you. Thank you so much for delving all these topics and going into sources and just giving it to us and for us to think about it, so we don't have to do a lot of work. So thank you so much.
There's a lot more. I just want to say what I did was very, very shallow, actually, and there's so much more to dig into, but gotta start somewhere.
Yeah, do some more digging, Raul. Okay, thank you so much. And I think we're going to be closing this presentation, and we got a PSDA meeting, so we'll have a break of PSDMers. We'll have a break of 5 minutes, and then we'll have a meeting. So that will be at 3:20.
3:20.
3:30. Okay.
Well, it'll be 3:20 if it's 5 minutes.
Okay, between three. Yeah. Anyway, 3:25.
3:25. Okay, 3:25. Gotcha.
Okay.
Okay, I'll stop the recording.
Okay, 3:25.
Okay, thanks. Let me see. There were 2 people